We're going to go over straight to Rabbi Jackie, and then we'll take your questions together, if that's okay. So if you have any questions for Alison, put them in the chat, and also for Jackie, and then we'll pick up on that once Jackie's presentation is finished. So thank you, and go over to Rabbi Jackie.
Hello, and thank you so much for inviting me this afternoon to this wonderful conference that you're holding. The lineup looks wonderful. I'm going to try and condense an hour's lecture into 20 minutes, so that should be quite exciting. And I may skip over some slides rather than concentrate on them. So when I looked into the life of Lily Montagu, I was in fact more interested in many ways at the social background, social and political background that she emerged from, because it seemed to me that this emphasizes the incredible work that she, and the incredible things that she managed to achieve. So one of the things that happened, of course, she was born in 1873, but in 1888, she would have been aware of the Match Girls strike. You may remember this was a London strike at the factory of Bryant and May, and it was caused by the poor working conditions, including 14-hour days, poor pay, excessive fines, and especially the health problems of dealing with a very severe health complication of working with white phosphorus, such as phossy jaw. And I'm going to give her that for a minute. She wrote at the later stage about the terrible conditions that were rife in those days. I love the sentence, Jewish girls were expected to marry, and they often married for the sake of deliverance from the crushing circumstances of their lives. You can imagine that. And I love the other bit down the bottom where they worked from 8 a.m. to 8 p.m. with an hour and a half for dinner and half an hour for tea. And in hot weather, the men often stripped to the waist. And the atmosphere created by overheated bodies was anything but pleasant. Right. And the politics, of course. Someone mentioned the suffragette movement just before. 1918, Parliament passed an act granting the vote to women over the age of 30 who were householders, wife of householders, or occupiers of property with an annual rent of £5 and graduates of British universities. Lily was not involved, as far as I know, herself very much in the suffragette movement, but it would have drawn attention to the marginal role of women in society and, of course, in synagogue. Then the other thing that was around at the time was the fear of Jack the Ripper and the fear of the uncontrolled sexuality of the poor. Though I did read that recent research suggests that his victims were not actually prostitutes, but were homeless women. And then, of course, there was the Jewish immigration, which included my grandparents coming over from Eastern Europe. Nathan Adler, the chief rabbi for 35 years until 1880, wrote that of the difficulties that these people had when they came, and that they had to take jobs working on Shabbat, contravening halakha, just to stay alive. And don't think that our dislike of refugees as a society is anything new. Look at this cartoon from on the Aliens Act. with Britannia saying, I can no longer offer shelter to fugitives. England is not a free country. And there's a good picture of the rabbi, well, he was the Reverend David W. Marks, because in those days they weren't rabbis except for the chief rabbi. Everybody else was a reverend. So against the social, the political stuff, there was also changes in the religious world. There was the growth of Reform Judaism in Germany and the founding of West London Synagogue in 1842. But I must tell you that the changes were minimal until the 20th century. The Reverend Marks was in fact very much a fundamentalist. You have to remember that in Europe in 1842, they were still assimilating the idea of a documentary hypothesis coming from the academic world dealing with higher criticism that was really developed from the 1860s. So Reverend Marks, in fact, believed that the Torah was absolutely divine. Everybody should follow it. What he didn't like was anything rabbinic. So people still walked to shul. And the reason why the synagogue was founded in 1842 was because the wealthy Jews living in that area, their wives objected walking on the very muddy paths, because they weren't paved roads all the way, over to the east end of London to go to synagogue on Shabbat. So they had to found a synagogue instead in the western part of London. But notice, it's all men down there. You can see a woman hiding there, maybe, behind ferns, but, definitely no women up in the front there. And this is how, when the new building of West London, you'll recognize the arc, it had its steps in front and it had its bima right in the middle. I must say, I think West London missed out when they went to the new architecture, the changes, and brought the bima forward here to allow for extra seating in the synagogue. But there were very few changes in the liturgy. There was only, the thing they did change was back to 1 day of Chag, because the Torah only says 1 day of the main festivals. The liturgy was based mostly on Sephardi liturgy. There was an organ. There was an English prayer, one of them, for the royal family. And there was a sermon. Eventually, they also shortened the Torah reading and the Haftarah. But men and women sat separately. Indeed, on the High Holy Days, when I joined the congregation as a student rabbi back in 1971, I still had to sit in the gallery for the High Holy Days for the first couple of years, until people got used to the idea that it was stupid having a rabbi come, or a student rabbi come down to the bima, take part of the service, and then have to go all the way upstairs to the women's gallery. There's the women's gallery up here, and you can see how it was organized. It was a very beautiful synagogue. And then philosophy, of course, she was being exposed to the teachings of Darwin. And that too must have had an incredible effect on her religious ideas. Now, she was part of the cousinhood. She was the 6th of 10 children. Her father was Samuel Montague, and I am convinced that this is a photograph taken outside the gates of West London Synagogue. I recognize the gates and the pillar. I could be wrong, but I think it is. Her father was a millionaire. He was a banker. He was a Liberal MP, and then became the first Baron Swathling in the House of Lords. Her mother, in the words of Lily, remained faithful all her life to the orthodox observances, both great and small, but Lily believes she did it out of wifely devotion, rather than personal conviction. She called her mother's religiosity elastic. It would be flexible and change. And there is a caricature of her father in Vanity Fair. So important he was that he made a caricature. She had, as a child, a very, very deep and personal sense of communion with God. When she was little, she had night terrors, and her mother assured her that God would not take her father from her. Lovely portrait of her father, because her father was just so good. And her father would come in and they would recite Psalm 23 together. But by the age of 15, Lily was convinced that orthodoxy offered her and other women little room for religious self-expression. But she'd only been given a very limited religious education. Her Hebrew remained never very good. But she had a childlike trust in God and theology. But how could you be part of a worshipping community that ignored you and that regularly recited a prayer asking God to make her grateful for the opportunity to serve him as a woman? She did enjoy Bible stories, though, and became imbued with a sense of a Victorian lady's real responsibility in life, which is to make the life of the poor better. You know, think of the books of Jane Austen and things like that, and you get a picture of how she must have felt at that period in her life. The so-called leisure classes, their education was too good to allow them to just sit at home and sew, but they felt the need to justify their existing by running some form of useful effort. So by 1890, she was running children's services in New West End Synagogue. She realized how utterly boring the long Hebrew services were to the children, if they prayed at all. And if they prayed at all, the prayer was that services should come to a speedy end. She worked with the rabbi of that synagogue, the Reverend Singer of Singer's Prayer Book, to learn and to eventually write a children's prayer book. The chief rabbi, Nathan Adler, wrote an English prayer for that prayer book. The first service was held at the synagogue, and there were 200 participants, children and especially their mothers. And for a few years, she went and held services over in the Hampstead Synagogue. She was a founder of the West Central Jewish Girls Club with her sister, Marion, and cousin Beatrice Franklin. And there's a picture of Beatrix with her husband, who was the more famous of the pair, Viscount Samuel. I do love her dress. Oh, isn't that wonderful? And look at the face. It's fantastic. But they have no model to follow in forming a youth club because, they had no training. And the more they have, they said, the greater our self-questioning, the more severe our responsibility. So they worked very hard trying to help the underclasses. They held Shabbat afternoon activities to increase the intellectual and spiritual opportunities for people in the round the area of Fitzrovia. And she also started running Shabbat afternoon services and doing concerts and outings. The services she conducted were brief in English and gave sermons on topics that she felt were of vital interest to the girls, and retained traditional prayers that she thought had meaning for modern Jews and Jewesses in the actual circumstances of their lives. But note that she did it in the afternoon so that they could still go to Orthodox shuls in the morning, and some of the time she was doing that herself with her family. Later, according to Nellie Levy, who was an early member of the West Central Club and later its leader, she told of a vision that Lily Montague had in 1892. And I hope that you've had chance to read it through. I love it. I will bind up those who are broken. I will set before them light and good through a faith in Judaism, so they have the strength wherewith to live. Her words are fabulous, aren't they? But actually, it had begun meeting earlier than this. She'd met young girls who had been involved in the Soho clothing trade. And someone from that trade said to her, you know, it'd be lovely if we could have a club for us. And the Honourable Lily took the hint. So she started providing social and educational work in Frith Street for Jewish girls who worked in the sweatshops of the area. When the number grew 17, they got 2 rooms in Dean Street. Marion, Lily's sister, joined them, but she remained a loyal and self-effacing helper to Miss Lily. The girls, of course, had left school at a very early age. Many of their parents had come over from Russia and Poland, and they didn't know very much English. So these clubs were not to keep them Jewish so much as to integrate them as Jews into English society, which was, by the way, what the JFS, the Jewish Free School, was founded to do as well, because they had all these immigrants and they were worried about them. The stated object was to bring brightness and refinement into the lives of Jewish working girls. She was really terrified of these young girls working and getting married, as I said earlier, just to get out of this terrible situation. She worked with others, trying to improve the wages and training to be given to these young people. It's really sad. When the war started, everything went crazy, of course. And the people working in these areas suddenly had no jobs. And she founded little workshops for them to have some jobs and kept them going in the earlier part of the war until work returned to them, largely doing uniforms for the army. She began working in some of the trade union stuff, but her work in this area has become largely forgotten. It became only associated with the needs of boys and men. And isn't it awful, really? The pioneering work of women often gets forgotten. It's not appreciated. It's maybe seen as being unnatural. Maybe that was what was going on. But she was not interested in changing the politics before she'd dealt with the problems. It was the problems that she saw that she wanted to deal with. As it says here, she didn't think in revolutionary terms. She wanted to extend the benefits that the capitalist regime had bestowed upon her. She wanted to use trade unionism for industrial progress industrial relations, improving conditions, benefiting all in the process. As we heard before, she became involved in the foundation of the Jewish Religious Union. She'd been running services on Shabbat for Jewish children, and then at the club. And, West Central has officially its beginnings in 1928, but I actually think it began much earlier. I would put the beginnings of West Central Synagogue into the club, because there she was giving these services for so many years before the Jewish Religious Union even really started. And she met and worked with Claude Montefiore, who gave her both the means and the confidence to redefine Judaism to allow for personal growth and expression. And that precipitated her formal break with Orthodoxy, leading to an estrangement with her father. And of course, this wonderful painting, I don't know when it was done, or sort of paintings put together, of the three M's. There they are, the founders of the liberal movement. It's an essay in 1899 that you mentioned already, Alison, in the Jewish Quarterly Review, asking all religious committed Jews to help her form and strengthening the religious life of the Anglo-Jewish community in the propagation of liberal Jewish teachings. And taught. Now, I found her document. Alison, you want to unmute if you're allowed? If you can say anything about this document, because I couldn't find much about it, except it has a date on it, 1898.
Yes, I think that was one of the first drafts of the article. That was what I was trying to show earlier.
I thought that was what you were trying to show earlier, and I thought, I'll show it for you later.
Thank you very much.
It's a great pleasure. Isn't it beautiful?
Yes.
Isn't it amazing? Of course, there was ongoing, and that's a lovely picture of Mattock. There was ongoing opposition to the beginnings of the liberal movement once it was seen to be different, with women and having some leadership roles, especially. Lily Montagu understood that nobody would take the Jewish Religious Union seriously if she became president. So in a book by Umansky, Dr. Ellen Umansky, she suggested, I don't know what her proof for this is, that she said to Claude Montefiore, to become the president of the movement while she did all the work. And this is Mattock, who then was the rabbi who advancement of liberal Judaism and became involved in founding the liberal movement. So she became involved. There's West Central Liberal Synagogue, got some gorgeous photos of the beginnings of the synagogue. She went and gave a sermon in Germany. Regina Jonas would have been around, the first woman rabbi in Europe, but we don't know whether she ever met her. I wish I knew. A picture she carried on throughout, right, her 80th birthday. There's her sister next to her, an absolute tower of strength, doing sermons and services and the things she loved in her life, her home, her siblings, her faith, that she was able to spread the word of God, and co-workers who were her friends. These were the things she appreciated in life. And I put this photo in because one of my congregants tells the story of her coming in a Rolls Royce with a uniformed chauffeur that belonged to her cousin. She wouldn't buy one of these. She always went by public transport. But her cousin said, "You're getting a bit old for that, dear. You've got to come in my car." So she borrowed the car to visit a congregant who was living in council flats in the 1950s in in Stamford Hill. And he remembers the fuss that all the rest of the people made when this car arrived outside the door with a chauffeur and the crowd that gathered round. So the Montagu Centre, of course, being named after her, and thought to end with one of her own quotes. "Religion urges us to fight evil as contrary to the divine law. It urges us to combat abject misery, sin and disease, because God is. In his name we can work, as we believe in cooperation with him, since through him goodness must ultimately prevail." One of the sad things was I never knew anything about her until I joined West Central Synagogue, really, because I wasn't brought up in the liberal movement. My teens and most of my rabbinic career had been the Reform movement. But I discovered that actually Lily Montagu, there was a gap really between her death and I became a rabbi in 1975. And I had no idea that this woman had existed and taken services and done all these things. Again, as a woman, she disappeared into the background, as Regina Jonas did. And it is good that we're now relating to her again and making links to what she did and what she taught and what she brought to this world. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Wonderful. Thank you, Jackie and Alison.
And I'm sorry, Sean, if I didn't notice your things because I never got your messages.
Your timing was absolutely perfect, and I could listen to you all day. Really, it's fascinating, and hopefully we'll hear the 1.5 hour version of this lecture at some point soon. We should organize this. It's really amazing, and thank you, Alison. Too. A couple of comments here. Chat for those people who can't see it or haven't seen it. My daughter went to LJY Netz Academia for the first time this year. She's 8 and had such an awesome time connecting with other liberal Jewish children. It's priceless, Alexandra Boyd says, so thank you for that comment. And then further on, Rabbi Jackie, I have read Daniel Langton's study of Claude Montefiore. There does not seem to be a contemporary scholarly study of Lily. Are there any studies you know about or have a plan to fill the gaps? So we'll have just about time for this question before we go to the next bulk of the presentation.
I actually mentioned a study by Dr. Ellen Umansky, who is the Carl and Dorothy Bennett Professor of Judaic Studies at Fairfield University. So Dr. Ellen Umansky, I'll put her in the chat. Oops, sorry, hang on. I'll stick her name in the chat. And if you look her up, you'll find a very interesting study. Okay, there it is.